I arrived in BC in 1965 from the UK, used to a fairly plentiful selection of European wines, good wines at very reasonable prices. I remember we used to buy wines occasionally for half a crown, which is an eighth of a pound. So that was in those old days. But at that time, BC liquor laws were just starting to emerge from the Dark Ages. I'm not sure we're fully out yet, but at that time, for example, the restaurants had only just newly started being allowed to be licensed. Before that, people had to eat if they went out to dinner, ate their dinner, and then dashed home and had a glass of wine. And in fact, we were asked in a couple of restaurants when we ordered wine, do you want that with or after your dinner? Because people were so used to it. Anyway, this talk is really about the 1965 onwards, and I've tried to divide it into three threads: ingredients, the clubs and organisation, and finally competitions and judging. But please remember that the internet didn't come along until about 2000, so researching prior to that is more difficult. So some of my facts may be wrong. Okay, start off with what we had to work with, the ingredients and grapes and so on. BC, when I arrived, had 4 wineries. There were Kelowna in Kelowna, Andres in Port Moody, growers here in Victoria who just made Loganberry wines, and Casabello in Penticton. And those were the only 4 wineries in the province. The wine was pretty awful, and unfortunately, we've still got that reputation in a lot of places because people won't try BC wines. They think, yeah, you know, and they're going back to days of Kelowna Royal Red and things like that, which were pretty awful. And the reason was that there were no vinifera grapes grown in BC. And there was a law that said that the wineries had to buy BC grapes before they could import anything. They had to buy everything that was available from the BC grape growers before they could import anything to the province. And the grape growers weren't interested in particularly good wines. They were looking for volume and because they just sold by weight. So the great majority of the vines were hybrids, a mix between usually vinifera, Vitis vinifera, and Vitis labrusca. And labrusca equals Welch's grape juice. I don't know how many of you have tasted that. That's what labrusca wines tend to taste like. So the wineries had really no option but to try and make the best they could with these really awful grapes. And well, there were some grapes imported from California. As far as I can make out, none of them were of the noble varieties. All the wine sales were controlled by the liquor distribution brands, with a poor selection of wines from elsewhere in the world. Thus, there was a demand to see if amateurs or artisans, as we now like to call it, could provide something more palatable. Individual families, particularly of Spanish and Italian origin, have been making wine for many years, but they relied on traditional methods, wild yeasts, very little sulfur dioxide, and the results were, to say the least, very variable. Sometimes they could make really good wines, and other times it was absolutely awful. So that's the background to the situation. And several groups of winemakers appear to have simultaneously formed in the 1960s. I know Vancouver actually started in 1960, and Chilliwack, Abbotsford, Vinavan, and Coquitlam were all active by 1967. A lot of what the wines they made were fruit wines, and often the grape wines came from cans of concentrate. My own number 1 wine of the 556 batches I eventually made, number 1 was Spanish red grape juice in a 2-litre can. concentrate. And we made it, and it was all not very good. My mother christened it Spanish heartburn, probably because we drank it far too early. And eventually, I did find a gallon about 5 years later at the back of a cupboard, and it wasn't that bad. But we didn't have much ingredients to start with that were good for great wines. Most of what was brought in for the Italian Portuguese community, and it was mostly Carignani, Muscatel, and Palomino, which were their grapes of preference. We were told there was no demand for Cabernet or any of the other noble grapes. And I believe at that time Spagnol's was the only operation that was importing grapes to BC. I moved to Victoria in '73, and although there were already 2 winemaking groups in the city, a group of us decided to form the Saanich Sommeliers in February '74. At that time, the only Victoria suppliers of Californian grapes was a mum and pop corner store called the North Douglas Delicatessen, which is now buried under the Mackenzie Douglas intersection, quite close to where the Nicholsons live. It was just in that area. The owners were Armando Barbon and his wife, and they existed mostly for the benefit of the local Italian community. The language in the store was nearly all Italian, and when the grapes arrived, the wife came out and helped shout over the Italians that I needed service. So it was interesting. So we started pestering them for some premium grapes and promised to buy a sufficient quantity to make it worth their while. And it all came up in 36-pound lugs from Lodi in California in the Central Valley. As a sort of side, there's now a Barbon place in Victoria because he got big enough that he built a huge warehouse there, not just for grapes, but for food supplies in general. And he eventually sold out to Cisco Food Services. So I have imagined that Mr. Barbon is quite a rich man now. The biggest breakthrough for quality wines was NAFTA in 1992, because it made this law about buying only BC grapes, the wineries only buying BC grapes, it made it illegal. So there was no incentive for the wineries to buy these awful grapes anymore, and they started importing large quantities. And as a result, they pulled out hundreds of acres of the hybrid grapes and replanted them with vinifera, and our tax dollars went into that to help them do it. But the result is that we now have a very vibrant wine industry, I think, that is producing some great wines. Our initial amateur winemaking was very crude by today's standards. The crusher only took 1 lug at a time. I don't know, there's a picture of it somewhere in our archives, but it was a hand-cranked crusher that just took 36 pounds of grapes at a time. The destemmer was a bit of chicken wire stretched underneath where it came out, and you had to put your hand in and sort of press the grapes through, and meanwhile all the grape juice is dripping down your hands, and then you throw away the stems. So it was pretty crude. We had a basket press. As an aside, I'll be moving house soon, and the club's basket press is sitting in my house, and I don't know what happens to it if nobody from the club comes to take possession of it, but maybe the executive would like to look into that. The winemaking Bible at the time was a book called The Art of Making Wine by Stanley Anderson. And Stanley Anderson was, he was a really interesting guy, and he formed the Wine Arts chain of stores. I remember when it was only one store on Broadway Avenue in Vancouver, but before he was finished, he had, I don't know, 8, 10 stores in Vancouver, Victoria, and I think one or two up Island. And he wrote this book, The Art of Making Wine, which was our Bible. It sort of told you all the sort of proportions for making second-run wines and how much acid to add, and you know, this sort of thing. A little bit later, Ted Underhill produced a book of loose-leaf, self-published, how to make wine, and I think probably several of us still have it. I mean, it's a loose-leaf binder that's got a lot of information. It's getting all dated, but that was our sort of second go-to source. The other thing that the wine art stores were really important for was that it gave us access to additives. Before that, where did you go to get an acid to add to a wine? They're just, who knew where to go? Because there were no wine supply stores. So wine arts sort of brought in things like that, and testing kits and siphons and primary fermenters and carboys and all those sort of things that we more or less take for granted now. Although I must say that I think Victoria is not very well served at the moment, and Hamilton Hops and Grapes is the only store I'm aware of that provides any of those.
Across the street there's the Blanchard Street Winery. They sell kits, and they've got some supplies there too.
Some supplies, but
yeah,
they're not set up to work for the amateur winemaker. Anyway, sorry.
And it was acid blend that they sold at that time. It wasn't tartaric or something.
Yeah, acid blend was a mix of tartaric, citric, and malic. They would never tell you in what proportion.
And the yeast, and the yeast was one or two varieties. Red Star, I think.
Yeah. So since then, of course, winemaking has progressed to the relatively sophisticated grapes, additives, yeasts that we now know. And I won't go into details about that because most of you know about those. The organization of clubs makes quite interesting material. Several clubs seem to have formed spontaneously in the 60s. As I said, I know of 4 that were going in the 60s. But there was little coordination between them, although at least 2 had open competitions. So they must have been talking to each other and to advertise their open competitions. But the 1971 was a pivotal year. It started with the inauguration of the Grapevine magazine. Now, a lot of you will not know what the Grapevine was, but it was a newsletter edited and produced by a small group of Vancouver winemakers with all aspects of amateur winemaking covered. There were updates from clubs, competition results, articles about winemaking, bus tours, notice of future events and entry forms and how to contact clubs, and it was just a really absolute fount of information. It started in May 1971 with 4 of the 7 clubs that they knew about chipping in a little bit of money to kick it off and get it going, and it was always, throughout its 39 years, mimeographed and snail-mailed. The editor at the end for many years, Tom Robinson, was a wingding winemaker and judge, and so 4 issues per year for 39 years until 2010, when Tom retired and nobody took up the cudgels. It was definitely not a Bakawa newsletter. It was independent, and the editor was always fiercely defending his editorial independence. Didn't want Bakawa telling him what to put in it or what opinion to make on anything. It was fiercely independent. Okay, now enough about the grapevine for just now. In late 1970, a largish group of us met in Penticton, where we went every year to the Harvest Grape Festival, which was a wine competition, and it was mostly partying, but there was a wine competition. And I think it was, I forget which of the motor inns. They eventually banned us because we were so loud, although we took over the whole place, and there was much merriment in the pool, and photographs were banned for various reasons. Anyway, in 1970, a group of the people at this Penticton gathering started talking about getting together and forming an umbrella organisation over the clubs. And a committee was formed, and the following year, 1971, that's why I say 71 was pivotal, because both the Grapevine started and Bakawa started, because at the 71 Penticton, the 10 clubs that were represented at that time there agreed to, they had a set of operating parameters. They didn't want to call it a constitution, that was far too formal. So they went on operating parameters, and 10 clubs, unfortunately not including any from the island, signed on, and that was the beginning of Bakawa in 1971. Bakawa was always to be the servant of the clubs, not the other way around. That Bakawa has no authority over any of the clubs. The clubs were quite adamant that they wanted to have their autonomy, and they looked to Bakawa to provide guidance and standards and coordination, but not direction. At its peak, Bakawa, I think in 1999, and this I did through searching through much of the Grapevine files, had 24 affiliated clubs. I won't bore you with the complete list, but it included 4 in Victoria. Victoria Sommeliers, Victoria Winemakers Guild was still going, Holy Cross, who were there to provide sacramental wines for the church, and also for their own consumption as well. And there was a short-lived club called Red, White and Brew, which was out in Brentwood Bay, I think. And there were clubs on the island in Nanaimo, Comox, Cedar and Hornby Island. Unfortunately, we're now down to 8 clubs in Bakawa's list of member clubs. And I think there are still some of the clubs going that just don't want to be affiliated with Bakawa. The Sommeliers have done their share in supporting Bakawa over the years. We've hosted several provincial and national competitions and have fully supported them, with our members taking many executive positions. I was the 7th president, and Sandy Bellows and Rick Homer both did multiple years as president, and Jerry Yip, don't know how many of you remember Jerry, but he was the treasurer for many years, a member of our club, and Sharon Beard was secretary of the Bakawa for many years. So we've done our share. And this was all before the days of Zoom, so Bakawa pays your ferry fare, but it took quite a lot of organisation to get over there, time too. Okay, competitions and judging. One of the first things that Bakawa did was to begin organising a provincial competition. There was already an Amateur Winemakers of Canada, but I cannot find where it originated. I think it was probably Ontario. And Bakawa's competition classes were largely aligned to meld with the Amateur Winemakers of Canada, AWC. And to run this, Bakawa created a competition handbook. That's up on the web on Bakawa's website, and is it's probably now in its 12th or 13th edition, and it's a very exact detailed document telling you how to run the provincial competition. Because although Bakawa didn't actually run the competition, it was always done by a host club or clubs, they wanted it to be uniform and to a standard. So the clubs accepted that Bakawa could tell them how to run the Bakawa competition. Bakawa pays for the actual competition costs, and any profit from the social events surrounding that are split between Bakawa and the host clubs. Competitions were virtually always judged by club members, virtually all with relatively no training. This is going back to the 70s and so on, which led to a lot of erratic results. All judging was by place rather than standard, which meant that some very good wines were totally unacknowledged, that you could come forth and would today get a gold or bronze, a silver medal, but you were nowhere because you weren't first, second or third. And early on in Bakawa, there was talk of setting up the Guild of Wine Judges. Ontario had one before us, I believe, and in 1974, a group of the better winemakers in Vancouver got a guy called Ron Taylor, who was the winemaker for Andre's Wines, to give a course on wine judging. And the graduates from that course then formed the BC Guild of Wine Judges. Since then, that group has expanded by training other judges, running training courses, and classes are run by existing members of the Guild. There are active chapters, as most of you know, in Vancouver, Victoria, and Nanaimo. And one of the important features of the Guild is that to maintain membership, the judges have to keep upgrading their qualifications or re-qualifying, not necessarily upgrading, I guess, but making sure that they're still capable of doing it. Until 1999, the competition categories were very generic. Dry white table, dry red table, rosé, dessert, after dinner, social, country, aperitif, BC grape, beer and cider at one competition I looked at. There was a Zinin competition, that was the only varietal that was run in the early 90s, I think, from the Nanaimo Club. They were quite forward in that. And until, in 2000, Bakawa in their competition introduced Bordeaux style, Pinot Noir, Zinfandel and Chardonnay as varietal classes in the provincial competition. And the other clubs gradually came into this, and we now, as you know, have a proliferation of classes that is quite daunting in some ways, I think. But and until 1989, all judging was for places 1, 2, and 3. And as I say, was unsatisfactory because a lot of wines could go unrewarded that should have been awarded something. Those of you that are judges will know that it's often a toss-up which wine gets best in class between 2 golds or half a dozen silvers and a quarter point on a judging sheet and 4 judges sort of milling around each with a glass. I mean, it really is a toss-up very often, I think, which wine comes out on top. And that was the old way with 1, 2, 3. I mean, you were tossing proverbial coins to decide the order of the wines very often. So it was decided that wines would be judged to a standard, gold, silver and bronze, and that's the system that remains with us today. Bakawa changed to medal judging in 1990, and clubs gradually changed from place to medal cup over the next 10 years. And the Sommeliers were amongst the last clubs to do it. We didn't move to metal judging until 2000. That's 50 years of history in, I don't know, 22 minutes. And I'm afraid the decline in the participation in Bakawa is a very worrying sign. Part of it is undoubtedly due to the advent of commercial winemaking stores, and I think part of it's due to the constraints on today's younger families. I know, looking at my own family, they just don't seem to have time to have the sort of hobby that we had when we were their age. But I would just finish by saying I would urge that we continue to actively support Bakawa. And I note with surprise that although we are amongst the largest clubs, there is presently no one on the executive from this club. There's only one other club, Langley, who are very small, who doesn't have a representative on the executive. And I really feel, I think there was something in Saanich's report about they're looking for a new vice president, and I really think we should seriously consider this, so that we've got a voice in the way that Bakawa goes and works and all the rest of it. So, there endeth the lesson. Happy to answer questions if there's time, Mr. Chairman.